They laughed when he went to war without armor, not out of cruelty but certainty. Iron-clad knights spat bets and clinked tankards as he walked from the keep with nothing but a sword, a ragged cloak, and a stubborn look that did not know how to beg for mercy. The battlefield expected a corpse. The court expected a cautionary tale. Instead, what came back was a man who had undone kings with a single stubborn truth and left rivals measuring their shame against his silence. If you want the whole story, the quiet decisions, the brutal bargains, and the one act that turned mockery into legend, subscribe now and join us as we peel back the armor of history. He was called Aldric of Wendon, though few bothered to remember it. In the spring of 1179, Aldric stood in the outer yard of Count Berengar's fortress, as the levy was called. Men arrived gleaming in mail and plate scavenged from older wars. Helmets bore dents like old scars. Horses snorted beneath banners, dyed in expensive reds and blues. And then there was Aldric, 30 years old, broad-shouldered, bare-chested, beneath a wool cloak, no helm, no hauberk, no shield, only a sword worn smooth at the grip and a face that did not flinch when laughter followed him across the stones. Armor was not merely protection in that world. It was proof of lineage, wealth, favor. To march without it was to announce that you were expendable. Aldric knew this. He had sold his father's mail years earlier to buy grain when the winter bit too hard. The Count's quartermaster had offered him a padded jack, used, rotting at the seams. Aldric refused it. He had learned young that borrowed protection came with borrowed obedience. The campaign was meant to be brief. Berengar sought to crush a rebellious marcher lord along the river Saale, a man whose tolls had grown bold enough to insult the Count's pride. The knights spoke of glory and plunder. Aldric listened, saying nothing. He had been raised on those borderlands. He knew the river roads, the fog that settled at dawn, the way men lied to themselves before killing. On the third day's march, they were ambushed. Arrows fell not as a storm, but as punctuation, sharp, deliberate. The armored men panicked. Horses screamed, twisted under their riders' weight. Aldric ran toward the tree line while others hesitated, metal dragging them into confusion. He did not have armor to save him, so he did not rely on standing still. He moved, low and fast, slipping into the brush where iron would snag and betray its owner. What followed was not heroic, it was desperate. Aldric stabbed a man who had tripped on his own shield. He smashed another's nose with the pommel when the blade stuck in a rib. Blood soaked his cloak. Not one drop of it came from him. When the ambushes broke, Aldric was breathing hard, hands shaking, not with fear, but with the shock of having lived. By nightfall, Berengar's force was half what it had been. The Count noticed Aldric then, not with gratitude, but calculation. Survivors always drew attention in defeat. Aldric was summoned, questioned about the land. He answered plainly, without flattery. He warned them not to pursue the river road. He named villages that would betray them for coin. He spoke like a man who expected to be believed or dismissed. They followed his counsel because they had little else. Over the next weeks, Aldric became useful in ways armor never could. He scouted alone, passed through towns without raising suspicion, listened at hearths where knights would never be welcomed. He brought back names, schedules, grudges. He learned that the Marcher Lord's men were hungry, paid late, and loyal only to the promise of survival. Aldrich suggested small raids, not battles. He argued that glory starved faster than men. Some officers resented him. A man without armor was not supposed to advise those who wore crowns on their helms. Yet, when the Count's nephew was captured crossing a ford Aldrich had warned against, it was Aldrich who arranged his release, trading information instead of steel. The nephew returned alive, humiliated and silent. The decisive night came without banners. Aldrich led a dozen men through a cattle gate left unguarded, just as he said it would be. They opened the granary doors and let hunger do the rest. By dawn, the Marcher Lord's garrison was in open revolt. Berengar rode in to accept surrender, claiming victory he had not planned and mercy he had not intended. In the aftermath, Aldrich was called forward. The Count offered him armor taken from a fallen knight, fine mail that glinted in the sun. The men watched, waiting for the joke to end. Aldrich did not take it. Instead, he knelt and asked for land along the Saal, 3 villages named precisely, all of them inconveniently placed. The request startled Berengar. Land meant permanence, influence. A man who had fought without armor was not supposed to think that far ahead. Berengar smiled thinly and agreed. As Aldrich rose, he saw the Count's eyes harden, not with generosity, but with recognition. The laughter was gone now, replaced by something colder. Aldrich had returned without armor, without wounds, and with something far more dangerous than glory. He had returned with leverage. The land along the Saal was not generous. It flooded in spring, froze hard in winter, and bred disputes, the way stagnant water bred flies. Aldrich took possession without ceremony. He rebuilt a broken mill, repaired river crossings, and posted tolls that were fair enough to be paid and firm enough to be respected. Men who had once served the Marcher Lord drifted in, not out of loyalty, but hunger. Aldrich paid on time. He asked for obedience, not devotion. Word spread that his villages were dull and safe. Berengar watched from his keep and grew uneasy. Victories fade, arrangements endure. Aldrich did not ride to court. He did not petition for titles. He sent grain when asked and men when required, but never more than the letter demanded. The Count's advisors began to whisper that Aldrich was building something quieter than a rebellion and sturdier than praise. The test came 3 years later with the imperial summons. The Emperor's envoy arrived with seals and expectations, troops for a punitive campaign east of the Marches, a war of correction and message. Berengar pledged knights and banners. He named Aldrich among those required to serve. Aldrich arrived again without armor. The laughter did not return. Men stared, remembering the river ambush, the granary night, the villages that now fed them. Aldrich brought not a gleaming retinue, but wagons of grain, spare horses, and men who could march long without complaint. The envoy raised an eyebrow. This was not how valor presented itself. Aldrich said nothing. He never explained himself unless pressed. On the march east, it became clear the campaign had been misjudged. Roads dissolved into mud. Supply lines stretched thin. Knights bickered over precedence while men fell sick. Aldrich worked without spectacle, rerouting convoys, bargaining passage through hostile towns, cutting losses early. He took risks that could not be sung about and avoided ones that would fill graves. when the emperor's cousin led a charge against a fortified ridge and was thrown back bleeding, it was Aldrich who argued against a second attempt. The cousin accused him of cowardice before the assembled lords. Aldrich accepted the insult, then laid out numbers, rations remaining, men fit for battle, the cost of another assault. Silence followed. The ridge was bypassed. Weeks later, the enemy capitulated for lack of support. Victory arrived thin and unsatisfying, as it often does. At the accounting, Aldrich was summoned privately. The envoy offered him a title, minor but official, and armor to match it, stamped with imperial mark. Aldrich listened and declined. He asked instead for confirmation of his river tolls and exemption from future levies beyond his lands. The envoy hesitated. This was not ambition, as the court understood it. Yet the seals were affixed, paper after all, weighed less than steel. Berengar's patience broke. On Aldrich's return, charges surfaced, irregular tolls, unauthorized negotiations, the whisper of withheld men. None of it was false enough to be disproven quickly. Aldrich was summoned to answer. He arrived unarmored, alone, carrying ledgers and witnesses. The hearing stretched for days. Each accusation was met with dates, names, receipts. Aldrich did not flatter. He did not threaten. He simply demonstrated that his obedience had always been exact and therefore undeniable. Berengar withdrew the charges, smiling as though generosity were the point. That night, Aldrich's mill burned. The fire took the roof and half the grain. No culprit was found. Aldrich rebuilt without complaint. He raised stone this time. He altered routes. He tightened term. The villages endured. Berengar aged. The court shifted. When Berengar died, his son inherited debts, rivals, and a dependence on river tolls he could not afford to challenge. Years later, during a famine that scraped bone from the land, Aldrich sent wagons upriver to the keep. No banners, no speeches, just grain and a note listing interest to be repaid in exemptions, not coin. The young count signed. He had no choice. Aldrich lived long enough to see his lands pass intact to his children. He was never knighted. No song carried his name beyond the river bends. When he died, they buried him without armor. As he had lived, the ledger remained, margins worn by use, decisions recorded in a hand, steady enough to outlast steel. Only afterward did the measure of his glory become clear. The Saal ran quiet. The villages held. Courts came and went, and each found the same truth written into the land. Power that does not need spectacle, does not invite challenge. History remembers banners and blades, but it is built by restraint, preparation, and the courage to refuse the performance others expect. Glory that lasts is often the kind that never asks to be seen. If stories like this help you see the past and power more clearly, subscribe to the channel. We'll keep uncovering the quiet victories that shape the world.